We're just All right, so thank you again, everyone, for being here this evening. This is our third of four Archaeology in Pajamas lecture series, virtual lectures via Zoom. So thank you all for taking the time out of your Thursday evening to come hang out with us and talk about all things archaeology. We're really appreciative of everyone's support. Thank you to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, the entity that's affiliated with the University of Arkansas, to help us put on this event, and also to the Arkansas Archaeological Society, which is our volunteer organization throughout the state of Arkansas. So if anyone is interested in volunteering, getting more involved in archaeology in Arkansas, please feel free to reach out to me at any point. We do have some excavation and lab volunteering experiences, so there's always something to be done, and we're really excited to involve as many people as possible. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Katherine Chiou. She received her BA in anthropology from NYU and her MA and PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley. Whoop, whoop, California. Um, she is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alabama. She's an archaeologist who is also trained as a paleoethnobotanist or archaeobotanist, specializing in the archaeology of the Andean region of South America. So, with that, we would really like to thank you for being here, Dr. Chiou, this evening, and I will turn over the presentation to you.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Jillian. Thank you to the Arkansas Archaeological Society, as well as the survey, and any other folks involved in putting on this wonderful lecture series. I'm really glad to be able to participate and to be here with you all tonight to share some of the work that I've been doing for the last 12 years, and to talk about archaeology and chili peppers and anything anybody else wants to talk about as well. So I'd encourage you to use the webinar chat throughout the course of this talk, as well as to have some questions. I know there's some time portioned at the end for that, and so I'm willing and able to talk about anything and everything. So again, thank you all for being here. I hope you all are eating dinner, or maybe some of you who have early bedtimes preparing to go to bed. If you're in your pajamas, extra points. But I'm here today to talk about the topic, which is hot stuff, unearthing the fiery history of chili peppers across the Americas. So let's get started. All right, again, welcome. Here's some cute pictures of chili peppers. Just a reminder that people love chilies. It's one of those things that I think just gets under our skin, and one of my favorite topics to talk about. I've been involved in doing this for over a decade. They've kind of fallen into my life, and I've been running with them ever since. A lot of my work has been on the early history of chili peppers, as well as the relationship that people have developed with them over time, and specifically in the Americas, though I'm also interested in how they've spread around the world. So what we're going to talk about today is really giving you a sense of the history and the overall trajectory of chili peppers, starting with, what are chili peppers? What are they botanically? What are they related to? What are the various species that we consider chili peppers that we've domesticated and have a long history with? um, as well as how we study them archaeologically. So you probably know that there's multiple perspectives at looking at the domestication history of chili peppers. And I think archaeology can offer a lot in terms of lending a unique perspective, as well as coming at this topic with the actual physical evidence in hand, right? So when we talk about things like origins and timing, it's the archaeologists that have access to that data, coming from archaeological sites throughout the Americas. And then finally, what I'm going to do is to kind of showcase some of the different kinds of projects I've been involved with dealing with chili peppers, ranging from very, very early stuff, so around 10,000 years ago. What is the evidence that we have from certain sites in Peru, all the way to looking at something from the historical record, so in the same region of Peru, but zooming over to roughly the early 1500s, to a context where the Spanish have arrived, and we're still looking at the impact of that on chili pepper use, to a more recent project I've been involved with, which involves looking at domestication of one specific species of chili pepper in Mexico, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Mexican cuisine is a one of the globally renowned cuisines that definitely embraced chili peppers and has had a long history with that particular plant. So a little bit about the genus Capsicum, which is, a Latin name. It is part of the larger family known as Solanaceae, which for those of you botany nerds out there, the solanaceous plants are the nightshade plants that also include domesticated plants like tobacco or eggplant, potato, tomatoes, etc. So it's one of the families that humans have relied on throughout time for potential domesticates that are useful for humans. We roughly count around 36 species today. I mean, it varies depending on what source you're looking at, but roughly 25 to 30 something is where we're looking at in terms of the total count of species that people have identified. And out of those, roughly five have been independently domesticated across the Americas. So taking a look at those five domesticated species, we have one that's probably pretty familiar to you all, and that's Capsicum annuum. So if you've been in a supermarket recently, and I'm sure all of you have because we rely on food to survive, you probably have seen a lot of these varieties, right? The Serrano pepper, the jalapeno, the poblano, these are all Mexican varieties that are heavily popular in the United States. The bell pepper, of course, is one that variety where we've essentially bred out the spiciness. And so that one is very popular for salads and stuffed peppers and all the kinds of dishes like that. You also may have seen things like capsicum frutescens, and one very popular pepper coming out of that is the Tabasco pepper. So if you've had Tabasco sauce, which of course comes from Avery Island in Louisiana, that is the Tabasco pepper or frutescens. Some of our spiciest peppers come from Capsicum chinense. So the habanero is one popular variety that you'll find in the supermarket. You also might see things like the Scotch bonnet. The spiciest peppers that I've mentioned include things like the ghost pepper, the scorpion pepper, more recently the Carolina Reaper, and then even pepper X, which is the most recent, most spiciest pepper in the world. And then we have our Andean varieties, Capsicum bacatum. You may have seen that if you have eaten in a Peruvian restaurant, but the yellow pepper, the ají amarillo, is one example of that. And then we also have the pubescens pepper, which is also known as the manzano pepper in Mexico. And that one includes a Peruvian variety known as rocoto, which has black seeds. So essentially, the story of peppers in the Americas is that we have this whole diversity of wild chili peppers all across the continents, right? Ranging from South America to around the top of Mexico into southern US. So they're basically there at the time that we think chili peppers were beginning to be domesticated when humans were coming over across the Bering Strait or along maritime routes and engaging with all kinds of plants in the New World. Out of all these ancestral populations, a couple we consider to be potential wild progenitors, we know of as wild progenitors. So, out of all the five domesticated species, there are three that are closely related, and it's known as the annuum complex. That includes chinense, frutescens, and annuum, the Mexican pepper that we see a lot in the supermarket. Those are all kind of coming out of what we think is Capsicum annuum ver glabrusculum. It's a mouthful. And then we have, of course, bacatum coming from the wild bacatum pubescens coming from potentially a variety of wild progenitors. So at the time of Columbus coming to the Americas, we know that there was different distribution of these peppers throughout. We have, again, the annuum mostly in Mexico. We have bacatum really in kind of the Peruvian area. We have pubescens in that highland spine, the Andes of Western South America. We have pubescens, not pubescens, we have chinense and frutescens kind of around Amazonia as well as the Caribbean area. So that indicates that there's been a long history as well as wide geographic range of people encountering this plant. Another thing that kind of complicates the domestication history of chili peppers is that they easily and readily introgress, meaning that they breed with each other pretty easily, right? So we all learned about like the biological species concept in high school, right? Where we're like, oh, species generally are defined by certain populations where they're kind of restricted to breeding with one another. And the plasticity or the malleability of chili peppers makes it really easy for humans to kind of play with them, right? And they have played with them over time. You can mix different species relatively easily. You can make hybrids. A lot of them are viable. And so we also see throughout the record some evidence of people manipulating these and sometimes reintroducing wild genes back into domesticated varieties, right? So it actually kind of complicates things for us, but it makes it really interesting because it suggests to us that humans, again, have this long, loving relationship with this plant and also the ability to do a lot with it. So, of course, the one thing I really have to address when it comes to chili peppers is this notion of heat. It's one thing that we obsess about today. It's one major characteristic of chili peppers. If we go all the way back to the origin of the genus Capsicum millions of years ago, very soon after the last common ancestor appeared, we have the appearance of basically pungency or spiciness, right? And so a lot of you have probably encountered this in eating chili peppers, is that they have this kind of physiological effect on us. The capsaicin, which is an alkaloid that is produced by this plant, causes an irritation of our gut linings, for example, the mucus linings. It basically reacts with our pain receptors, so it makes us actually feel like our bodies are burning. What this actually causes is kind of a plain pleasure symptom to a certain extent at certain heat levels. Oftentimes, the body will release so many endorphins that people have described this sensation as almost being like a high, right? So there is an addictive quality to it. And for people that consider themselves chili heads who chase that high, oftentimes they require more and more heat to be able to achieve those same results, right? And so part of the reason for why chili peppers may have been domesticated, other than certain functional explanations, are that like it causes this almost like roller coaster effect where you feel like you're encountering danger when you're not. And for those adrenaline junkies out there, that can be something that's really captivating, right? So something that was essentially evolved to protect the plant, to prevent it from being consumed by certain predators like mammals, actually resulted in other kinds of mammals like us, especially us, being really, really interested in it. Now, interesting enough, when I talked about the distribution of those wild progenitors throughout the Americas, one major reason for why that's the case is that the main sort of organism responsible for spreading chili peppers around is actually birds, because birds are to a certain extent not affected by capsaicin. They don't feel that burning sensation. And so they eat the chili peppers and they fly around and they spread it everywhere, right? Hence why it has such a wide distribution. So today, I would say we're going through a moment with chili peppers. If any of you have engaged at all with social media or YouTube, you probably have seen people partaking in hot chilies challenges, right? Consuming them oftentimes to an extent where they're crying or their mucus lining is irritated, right? So the snot's running down their face. We have channels producing content like Hot Ones, for example, that generate millions of views, where the only purpose is to progressively consume hotter and hotter sauces until the interviewee can barely speak. So you yourself can also try this challenge out now. I believe they sell these sauces in a lot of stores. We had the hot chicken ramen challenge going around for a while, as well as the Pocky chip challenge. There's whole festivals devoted to chilies. Like, for example, in New Mexico, we have the Hatch chili capital of the world going on there. Colorado also has their chili. So again, it's something that humans have really gravitated towards. It's a plant that seems to have a lot of personality that draws humans in. And I think we've been captivated with it. Wait, not only today, but also in the past, right? There's evidence of a long history of obsession with this plant. And that's particularly highlighted in this quote by Alenco Garcilaso de la Vega, who is a man that is the son of an Inca noblewoman as well as a Spaniard. He's writing in the 1600s about Andean culture, right? And he writes, that chili pepper is a condiment that all the Indians of Peru use, whether in stews, cooked in a meal, or roasted. Without these fruits, they cannot eat. In my land, there are people who refuse to eat if they do not accompany their meals with this fruit, right? So people were so interested in this to the point where a meal was not a meal without chili peppers. And we can think of people today who also need hot sauce, for example, to accompany their foods, right? You have Tabasco company making hot sauce holsters that you can kind of, wear on your belt and you can take your hot sauce with you everywhere. So we kind of see evidence of this today as well. In terms of like the global dominance of chili peppers, and just to give you an idea of how popular they are around the world, I think currently, last I checked, they were the number three most consumed crop in the world. And so, obviously very important commercially. We have a couple varieties, a couple species represented in the global market, but essentially what really allowed them to spread is, of course, the opening up of the Columbian Exchange. So we all know in 1492, Columbus encounters the New World. As a result, we have this beginning of this global trade between the Old World and the New World, where certain ingredients were going over to Europe and Asia and Africa, and other things were moving over to the Americas. And part of that suite of crops that moved over to Europe, including things like tomatoes and potatoes and corn, was chili peppers. Now, the interesting thing about that is that, originally, when Columbus encountered chili peppers, he thought he potentially had made a great discovery of a cash crop. So if you situate this around the time that we're looking at, black pepper was really popular. It was something that was highly coveted. It commanded a very high price. It came mostly out of a small area around India. And as a result, he thought like, okay, this particular plant, which I equate to being like pepper, right? Hence the name pepper in the name chili pepper. Um, it possibly could make me a lot of money. So he was very excited about it and brought it over to Spain. Unfortunately, it didn't actually take off like he thought it would. Chili peppers grow relatively easily. They can be dried and, of course, traded across long distances. And so it didn't turn out to be a cash crop. But because it was something that people kind of equated to black pepper, right? Part of the theories of like why certain areas adopted it to the extent that they did was that they had some kind of correlate with it, whether it be mustard or pepper or something else like that. It became just a phenomenon, and it's really spread since then. Now, thinking about the routes of entry that it could have taken, a lot of what we see today in terms of the geographic distribution of chili peppers is tied mainly to who was doing the trading and along which trade routes. So the Spanish, of course, are taking things from areas like Mexico over to Europe. So Capsicum annuum was traveling in that particular way and then moving across overland routes. Then we have the Portuguese being responsible for moving things along a lot of maritime routes. So in parts of Africa and, of course, the Indian subcontinent, and then all the way into Southeast Asia. So we have areas of the world where there's a confluence of different kinds of peppers meeting together, and we see that represented in the cuisines today as well. So certain things like Capsicum frutescens, which is coming out of mainly kind of the Brazil circum-Caribbean area, are found in areas like Africa, like the piri-piri pepper, for example, as well as in China, where the Portuguese had a lot of influence and presence. So of course, chili peppers are in a lot of different kinds of cuisines. If you kind of look at it from a world map perspective, a lot of the cultures that are heavily chili based are kind of along the equatorial area. And there are some theories as to why that might be, because chili pepper has things like antifungal, antibacterial qualities. So it can help prevent spoilage or people getting food poisoning. But I think it really goes beyond that, right? Outside of thinking of functional restrictions like where it might grow, or again, like, what kind of benefits it might offer for food safety. It's something that, like, if there was potentially certain kinds of inclinations or correlates that existed beforehand that could have allowed for chili peppers to slot in, then people were probably a little bit more likely to take it up. And we see this obsession growing to the point where, like, in areas like Korea, which today are very much areas of, a lot of emphasis on chili peppers along with other kinds of flavors. Um, some scholars even go as far as to say that chili pepper is indigenous to Korea and have tried to make that connection through the historical record. So again, like people love it. Similar to the potato in Ireland, it has become a part of people's identity, to the point where people kind of forget about its American roots. So zooming back far in time, thinking archaeologically, what is it that we know right now about the evidence for chili peppers or for the genus capsicum? The earliest evidence we have tends to come from around 10,000 years before present. As you can see on this map, there are certain areas of concentration where we have a lot of evidence for chili peppers. And just for further background information, this is mostly from macrobotanical evidence, so like uh, plant remains that you can see with your eye, as well as some microbotanical evidence, mostly starch grains. But for the most part, it's kind of a skewed map because it's showing us essentially where things typically preserve, as opposed to like a whole picture of where chili peppers could potentially be, right? So we see a lot of chili pepper evidence in coastal Peru, where it's really dry and desertic, as well as a couple of other points where we're looking at, dry cave sites that are high up in the mountains that don't really have a lot of humidity or precipitation. And as a result, there's a higher propensity for things to preserve. So that's something that we as archaeologists oftentimes have to deal with. So the absolute earliest date that I can give you all right now comes from a site known as Paradones in coastal Peru. So this is actually a directly dated seed that was recovered. So it was dated through radiocarbon dating. And we're looking at around 10,300 to 10,600 years before present, right? So quite old. Again, it's not the earliest interaction between humans and chilies. We're thinking that it probably goes well beyond that, but in terms of hard evidence, we do have this particular date to work off of at the moment. So in a lot of the discussion today about the evidence that I've sort of been working with, I focus a lot on seeds. And for those of you that don't have a lot of familiarity or background with archaeobotany or paleontobotany, you may wonder, like, why seeds in particular? Why not other things? Well, seeds typically, in terms of looking at, again, the larger kinds of plant remains that typically will preserve, are a bit more hardy. They survive the digestive tract, for example, a little better. They typically will have a higher chance of being preserved than other sort of vegetative beds like stems and flowers and leaves, for example. And so we typically have higher recovery of those. Furthermore, even though we tend to find them more, for the most part, in terms of thinking about their utility in the domestication studies involved with chili peppers, they've been kind of ignored. Um, Oftentimes, botanists, for example, rely heavily at looking at different kinds of traits in current plants, right? Looking at like, oh, which flowers have purple flowers, which ones are white. Let's look at the calyx, right? And let's look at the number. Like, it's all different kinds of traits based on extant plants as opposed to archaeological plants. So we have an opportunity here to really address evidence that's from many years ago. And another thing that we have to do essentially that hasn't been done with the archaeological evidence is understand how to speciate them. So I've mentioned before that there's a really complicated history because there's so many players, there's a cast of characters involved, different kinds of domesticates, different kinds of wild progenitors, all potentially intermixing to a certain extent, depending on when humans were bringing them together and whatnot. And so trying to be able to separate them is something that we potentially could do and could offer a lot of benefits. And so the table on the right is just showing an example of some prior work that had been done by Barbara Pickersgill that measured things like looking at width as well as the range of measurements. But overall, it's still rather limited in terms of what it can tell us and how it can help us do the things I've mentioned. So some of the stuff that we've been able to do with these peppers is essentially photograph, document them, as well as measure them. This is a field of study known as like morphometrics, right? We're taking a bunch of measurements to help us be able to identify things. And so we've been using photography equipment as well as software in my lab to do work on a lot of seeds. Obviously, please don't read through all of this, but this is essentially just showing you the kinds of things that we do when we're trying to design these kinds of studies, where we're trying to look at different kinds of attributes that we can measure that can help us kind of narrow down how to think about these things and how to begin to categorize them. So things like looking at seed area, seed perimeter, general sphericity, so how circular is the shape, looking at the texture of the seed coat. Is there any sort of topography there? So all kinds of characteristics, some more helpful than others, as we'll soon learn. So just to give you an idea of some of these attributes, we have things like seed shape, and immediately you can see from this that there are some examples that seem a little bit different than others, right? Certain shapes that look a little bit more distinct, and that might be helpful. So we've got some examples of modern seeds and archaeological seeds that we've categorized as certain kinds of species. We also have the testa or the seed coat. These are scanning electron microscopy images showing you, how that varies from species to species, with some like the capsicum pubescens or the red manzano variety down on the bottom. You get really dramatic topography or reticulation in some areas versus other seeds where it's much more smoother surface. So that might be helpful. We can look at just, similar to the Barbara Pickersgill study, we can look at certain kinds of seed measurements like length and width. We also looked at the angle of the beak. So those of you familiar with chili pepper seeds will see that it has a little bit of a protuberance around where the attachment scar is. And so that angle varies from species to species as well. We have the extent to which that little nub then sticks out. And for some of them, like this is much more obvious than for others where there's less of a protuberance. And then we also have differences in terms of the thickness of the seed at the margins, right? So we can section these and then measure those as well. And also, like I mentioned before, the attachment scar, which I also refer to as the seed's belly button, where it's attached to the placental wall of the fruit, that also varies in shape from species to species. So just to give you an idea of like, what we were doing, we were taking all of these measurements, jotting them down in a spreadsheet. And of course, they varied from variety to variety. We tried to get a rather large sample, finding them from USDA repositories to like commercial sellers and stuff. And then we brought this together, measured all of them, and tried to make sense of the data. So just to give you an idea of, just variation, you can see, certain things will pop out at us. Like, for example, the capsicum chinense has a more circular attachment scar. So that thing was kind of distinct for it. We have capsicum pubescens, as I mentioned before, having really dramatic, large margins on the outside. And so when you see it in section, you can see that there's a big difference in terms of that shape. So that might help you immediately identify that seed. So we did something similar to what botanists do with modern day plants. We created an identification key to help scholars, help researchers, or those interested in seeds be able to speciate their particular seeds that they were finding archaeologically. Then we also did some multivariate analyses and found that, like, yes, these things do kind of separate, right? Which was encouraging to us because essentially it meant that there's a possibility of us being able to classify these seeds based on the data that we had collected. So what did we do? We decided to then apply this to archaeological seeds. So in the first case study, I mean, this was the origin for all of this. What happened was Tom Dillahay, who's an archaeologist at Vanderbilt, working at the sites of Huaca Prieta and Paradones, and a couple other collaborators, including Christine Hastorf at UC Berkeley and Tuccio Bonavia, who's an Andean archaeologist based in Peru. And we came together to basically figure out how we might work with this massive data set that existed at these particular sites. So just to give you a little bit of background, we're dealing with very early data. The pre-ceramic period in Peru kind of extends over a couple thousand years. It's the time where we see like, domestication, incipient domestication to like more fully fledged domestication. We see people starting to build monumental architecture. There's increased complexity. So if you're interested in thinking about complex societies and the rise of complex societies, it's a really interesting time period to look at. But essentially, what we were tasked with was looking at this specific set of the botanical evidence and making some sense of it. So here's a picture of the site itself. You can see that large Waka Prieta mound that had been built up over time. It's located right on the ocean, so the Pacific Ocean is in view. And then what you see in terms of the green is the current modern day agricultural fields which surround the site. So what had happened was we took that approach that we had done with the modern seeds, looking at how to speciate. We then applied that to archaeological evidence, and then we organized our identifications by time period, right? With phase two being the earliest time period, so roughly like 9,000 to like 7,000 years, then phase four, 7 to around 4,000 years, phase five, like after that. And what we saw essentially was something really surprising. A lot of our early seeds were coming from four of the five domesticated species. As we move a little bit further in time, we see that there starts to be a little bit more dominance of certain kinds of species. And then finally, in phase five, it's almost exclusively Capsicum bacatum, which if you're in Peru today, that's the yellow pepper or the ají amarillo. And it's one of those chilies that basically defines coastal Andean cuisine. So it's kind of an interesting look at how things went from something that was more diverse in the early days to almost a local preference for a certain kind of chili, right? Similar to what we see in New Mexico, where it's all about the hatch chili and everybody kind of coalesces around it and adopts it as an identity. So an archaeological example of that. Another thing I wanted to look at was, okay, if there's such an emphasis on Capsicum bacatum, how is it changing over time? So what we did was we got a bunch of different examples of this particular chili pepper from a variety of collections, including the stuff from Waka Prieta and Paradones, as well as some plant remains housed at Harvard. And what we saw is that through time, there's almost a increase in size all the way up into the time of the Inca and a sudden decrease around the time that, obviously colonization happened. The Spanish came and conquered the Inca, and then begins a period of colonization. So we explained that by essentially saying, potentially, obviously, there's not a ton of data, but it was suggesting that there may have been some kind of impact to traditional ways of life, traditional ways of cultivating plants as a result of a lot of the things that happened around the time of colonization, including things like demographic collapse, up to 90% in some cases, disease, obviously, people being moved around as a result of certain kinds of policies imposed by the Spanish. And as a result, there's a decrease in selective pressure on size to the point where modern day seeds are a lot smaller. And this kind of also correlates with the maize evidence. So if you're interested in corn and the history of corn, the Inca were very much about like bigger and bigger seeds. And so like one variety of corn is known as Cusco Gigante, which if you've ever had like corn nuts, it's similar to corn nuts, they're larger kernels. And again, that's something that the Inca produced. And so we were kind of proposing that potentially this could be an example of just diminishing selective pressure as a result of large scale events like this. So thinking about like, again, tracking the history of chili peppers and seeing what we can gather from archaeological insights, we're now moving into our second case study, which is a colonial case study from the site of Carrizales. We're roughly in the same region. We're like two valleys up from the previous example in coastal Peru. Again, dry, desertic, so good preservation. But now the Europeans have come, colonization has happened, and it's around a time of a policy that's been implemented by the Viceroy Toledo, which is known as reducción or reduction, right? So it's similar to what happened to Native peoples in North America, where people were essentially divorced from their lands and then moved around the landscape as a way of kind of breaking people social bonds apart, mixing different language groups together, putting people on less productive land, and then of course using this as a system of tribute to get people to produce certain things for the Spanish. And of course, part of that was, creating these like towns in a very specific style with central plazas, grid systems. You may have heard of things like this happening in the Spanish Empire. And so we have an archaeological site that follows this particular pattern, located next to the Pacific Ocean, historically a fisherman's village. And then, of course, it turns into this type of settlement where you have a sort of central area where you have a church as well as other kinds of important administrative buildings, and then people are living around the site in a very structured grid system, right? And the point is to not only Christianize, but also bring people into the civilized Spanish way of life. And so our question in sort of approaching this project is how is this impacting food, right? And I'll get to chili peppers in a second. So, in terms of the animal remains, what we see is this like radical shift in animal foodways. Again, this is a fisherman's village. Historically, people were consuming a lot of fish as well as other kinds of marine organisms, high diversity in that. And then suddenly we see a rapid decrease in the consumption of those particular foodstuffs and more of an emphasis on Eurasian domesticates. And there was an explosion in the Americas of things like pig. And of course, certain areas, like especially in the South, we're still dealing with the ramifications of that. But the interesting thing too is that we see this spatialized. So areas around the church are eating more of these Eurasian domesticates than areas a little bit further away where they're maintaining a little bit more of a traditional diet, but still heavily incorporating Eurasian domesticates. Now, meanwhile, on the reverse side, the plant foodways suggest that there's some introduction of Eurasian domesticates, things like grape, barley, and that coveted black pepper. There was one example of black pepper in the entire site, some lentil remains, and then some citrus hybrid seeds as well. But for the most part, the diet was still very indigenous in character. And I can show you in a second what that looked like. You can see a lot of these plants here are indigenous, and we can see a breakdown in terms of the proportion of the different types of plants in these different contexts. And what we see is that, chili peppers, which are in green in this figure, are pretty much in every single context, but then like heavily dominate or are heavily present in the areas around the church, right? And this to me suggested the possibility of chili peppers maintaining a tradition of being very much part and parcel of celebratory feasts. We see examples archaeologically. So this is from work I've done many years ago for my dissertation in a valley close by as well. And here you can see the different peaks of chili peppers, one from an everyday context and one from a feasting context that shows, again, that chili peppers were very much part and parcel of people's daily lives, but especially in feasting contexts, special contexts that involve some kind of celebratory event. They're everywhere, right? They're very much a big part of what it means to have a special kind of food event. So I thought that was an interesting continuity, despite all of the disruptions caused by colonization and conquest. People are still practicing some of their native traditions in a similar way. So finally, I'm going to move into the last case study. I'm going to try to get through this relatively quickly so we have time for Q&A. But this is the most recent work that I've been doing on Mexico with a variety of Mexican collaborators, as well as Christine Hastorf again. And this one is also involving a couple amazing students as well, who I want to acknowledge. So this particular project arose from a paper that came out in 2015 that essentially was taking on a very novel approach to chili pepper domestication in Mexico. of, again, Capsicum annuum, which is that one that appears in the supermarkets quite a bit, and bringing together different lines of data to essentially figure out where chili peppers are coming from. So they brought in some genomic data, they brought in paleobiolinguistics, they looked at language to figure out where things originated from. They looked at the ecological data in terms of current day modeling for where chili pepper can grow, and they bundled it with a little bit of archaeological data, which I thought was great, except for the fact that it's essentially consisting of two data points. And as we mentioned before, there's a problem with preservation bias in archaeology that we all have to be aware of that affects our interpretation, where, you have to recognize the fact that in most parts of Mexico, chili pepper just simply isn't going to preserve as well. And so relying on these two disparate points isn't necessarily the best way to like weigh down your model in terms of archaeology. So we were thinking archaeology could potentially do more. So what we did was we did similar approach. We brought together different lines of data set. I had an ecological modeler who was able to look at the models of where chili pepper could have been all the way up to 20,000 years ago. We brought in some archaeology in terms of looking at all the sites in Mexico and which sites existed where, according to time period. We did a similar thing with the seed morphometrics to help us look at differences in the peppers, as well as melded in a little bit of ethnobotany as well to look at what the impact of indigenous ways of cultivation were on chili peppers. So here's our cast of characters. We have essentially the Capsicum annuum, the one domesticate, Capsicum frutescens, which in this particular case study we consider domesticated slash semi-wild because it's something that's more managed and not as present in human spaces as the annuum. Then we have the wild progenitor, the Glabrusculum, and then two chili peppers that are completely wild that humans have never really engaged with. So looking at, again, the benefit of doing the project this way is that we relied on evidence of data that my collaborator, Araceli Aguilar Melendez, had collected over many, many years out of interviews and collections done with indigenous populations across the Americas. So a really novel and great data set of seeds, plants, as well as knowledge coming out of Mexico. So looking at just, seed area, these are violin plots showing where typically these areas are. We see that Capsicum annuum, the domesticate, tends to be bigger, especially the commercial varieties, and then the indigenous varieties are a little bit smaller. And then we have the frutescens, which is semi-wild, semi-domesticated, the wild progenitor, and then the two other ones that have never really been messed with humans. So I know this is a very complicated plot, but essentially what we have is a continuum. Using that same multivariate approach before, we have different kinds of factors pulling things in different ways, and a continuum of the annuum, domesticate, all the way to the very wild one. So these two separate out really well. We have the commercial one on this end of the spectrum. Then we have the land race. Then we have the semi-wild, semi-domesticated frutescens, then the wild progenitor over here. And then what we did is we took this approach and then, similar to before, incorporated the archaeological data. So these black stars are archaeological seeds, and you can see where they plot, right? They plot again along this continuum with the commercial varieties all the way back to ones that are looking a little bit more like the wild progenitor. So just looking really closely at the data for a second, we got a bunch of seeds from a bunch of different Mexican archaeobotanists as well as collections that existed. We took on that similar approach. We measured and we photographed everything. We used that discriminant analysis to help us generate identifications. And here you can see a rather complicated way of visually displaying what these identifications were. And, to save you time from looking at the actual acronyms, we've got the wild progenitor appearing early on. We've got a mix of different ones over here, especially into the post-classic period, which is actually relatively late. We see sites like Gila Nakits, for example, having a variety of different kinds of peppers. As we move on into colonial periods and after the colonial periods, it's almost an exclusive reliance on the annuum that is appearing to be commercial in nature, right? So similar to the patterns we've seen before, where there's a lot of diversity, and then through time we see more reliance on single varieties or single species. So really quickly, just about the ecological niche modeling. I mean, this is amazing data. Essentially, what it allows us to do is have a window into potentially where chili peppers could have grown through time, all the way from modern day to around 20,000 years ago, which is the last glacial maximum. That's when the glaciers were at their most furthest extent. We have a window into like what's going on during the Holocene period, which is the beginning of like, basically 10,000 years ago when agriculture came about to the mid-Holocene and again to current modern day. So how to read this is essentially to look at the spectrum of the color. The blue end is higher suitability. The orangey yellow end is lower suitability. So it allows us to get a sense of like, if we think humans were coming in and engaging with chili peppers at a certain time, where might chili peppers have existed, right? And we did this for three of our species, the wild progenitor, modern day annuum, as well as the semi-domesticated capsicum frutescens. We also brought in the archaeology in terms of looking at where the sites are. So for this is a it's a proxy for where humans are at certain times, right? So what we're looking for is a meeting of both humans as well as plants. So we got access to all of the registered Mexican archaeological sites provided by INA and plotted them according to time period, right? So we get a sense of like, again, where these human settlements are. And when we bring all this data together, what we see essentially is certain areas are more likely to support chili peppers, right? So in that original craft paper, what they had concluded after bringing in all these different data sets is that the modern day area of Tamaulipas in Mexico was the most likely origin area due to high biodiversity, right? High diversity of chili pepper um, varieties existing today. Our argument is that it's kind of flawed to kind of look at the environmental modeling just based on what currently exists today. It's a common logical point that botanists make when they're trying to think about origins, right? Where's the area of greatest diversity? Oh, that's the likely place that's the home of all of those different plants. But if you look throughout time, here's the mid-Holocene, here's the Holocene, here's the late glacial maximum, that area of Tamaulipas is actually not highly conducive to capsicum. And instead, we're looking at certain areas like the Yucatan over here, right? The historical home of the Maya, for example, as being somewhere that could potentially have supported capsicum annuum, very glabriusculum, right? The wild progenitor, right? So this suggests to us that potentially we're dealing with preservation bias again, right? The Yucatan is an area that's extremely hot and humid. Macrobotanical remains do not preserve well. So we may be needing to look at different kinds of data to be able to address the issue of chili peppers. And so again, just another reminder or sort of hard lesson that like we can't just rely on the kinds of archaeological remains that typically preserve, but kind of understand the kinds of methods we're using and then how that impacts interpretation. So I'm not going to cover the other stuff we're doing right now. We're doing stuff with ancient DNA. We're doing stuff with machine learning, as well as burning experience to look at the impact of taphonomy on seed shape and size. And so these kinds of projects are continuing, but hopefully I've at least given you an idea of typically how we might approach these kinds of questions from an archaeological perspective and how archaeology can contribute to the larger question or the larger story of where peppers come from and potentially where they're going. So thank you so much for listening in. I appreciate you all being here, especially so late on a Thursday night. If you have questions, I'm happy to address them. And also you can email me. There's my email as well as my lab website. So happy to have you all continue this conversation after this talk as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine. That was fantastic and super interesting. Just coming from an archaeologist standpoint and just being able to relate it to current day and what we experience, with, social media things like Hot Ones. I was like, yes, I know that show. So bringing it all together is really, really cool. There's one question that I can see here from Lily, she said, in regards to the first case study, you explained the diversity of chili species during the pre-ceramic, maybe pre-classic period. Do chili species or the frequencies of such vary between households during this period, or is it mostly uniform across the site? And do we see some households using a specific species more than others?
So, Lily, this is a great question. And as a household archaeologist, I'm very much like this is like up my alley. In terms of the kinds of data we got, we essentially got these seeds bundled by excavation unit. So, at least in terms of thinking about the spatialization of activities and understanding things inside households, outside households, household to household, there wasn't a lot of visibility with that. So, I think that's something that potentially, like, if there was further research, could be looked into because I am really interested if this diversity is something that is represented across all households, or it's something where like certain houses ate certain peppers which were more highly valued versus others. Are there class distinctions? Are there distinctions other than class? So there are a lot of questions that can be asked there, but I'll say in terms of the diversity, one thing that's really interesting about it that, I mean, to a certain extent was surprising to me, but maybe shouldn't have been, is that, I mean, this kind of wide scale, long distance trade is something that other lines of evidence in terms of looking at the artifacts were already saying, right? People had these networks, people were traveling long distances and moving goods from one area to another. So, to a certain extent, like, the chili peppers, like we have things like pubescents, which we know are a highland crop. They're mostly restricted to higher altitudes, are coming in. And so it's kind of evidence of this time where people are moving about quite a bit. And then as to why they decide to hunker down and focus on specific things, I'm not quite sure, but it's something that, like I've said before, like we mentioned, we see across different kinds of contexts across space to the point where today we think of like, oh, Thai food, bird's eye chili, right? Or we think of like, New Mexican food, the hatch chili, or Mexican food is going to be like jalapenos or, chipotles, which are jalapenos or things like that. So, yeah, maybe it's just sort of exemplary of like how people approach food and the extent to which food is part of identity. But I mean, I think this definitely merits a lot more research, and I think I would be really interested in kind of examining things on a more sort of close scale. So great question, but unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for it.
So, I think I can let people talk,
Yeah, I
if
see a
they have
question
their
from
hands raised.
Tammy.
Yeah, yeah. Let me see if this works. Oh, okay, Tammy, you should be able to talk now. Hopefully, maybe, if you want to unmute on your end.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Hi,
Okay.
Tammy.
Hi there. How are you? I found this fascinating, and I honestly, as far as the Arkansas aspect of it, I want to say I missed the other series, and I hope you're going to continue these. I had no idea you were doing these until I saw this one. So, um, I I just really enjoyed this. I love peppers. I cook with them often, and so I was asking about more regional. It um, kind of grew up in the Ozark Mountains in Missouri, but it's visit Arkansas all the time. And just curious as far as the peppers and what is found there archaeologically in your digs or what have you. Did you find anything of age? How long they've been
Uh,
consumed there?
I would absolutely be curious to learn about this more. I can say from a perspective of North America, I know we mostly covered Mexico, Central America, and South America. One fascinating sort of mystery in the realm of chili pepper studies is why has North America, to a certain extent, been left out of the conversation? Because we know that the wild progenitor does extend to North America. We know, for example, that the Mesoamerican cultures were very much interacting with the Southwest as a
Mhm.
whole,
Right.
engaging in trade, but we don't actually see chili peppers until really late in the record, basically almost till the time of like contact. So right before contact, we have the first evidence, I think roughly around 1400 AD, of chili pepper in the Southwest, right? Which is actually really late in the sequence. And so what it suggests to us is that there's a clear identity boundary or distaste for chili peppers, right? And we see this with food all the time, right? We're like, oh, the French, they eat frogs. They eat horse, right? They're different
All
than
right,
us. We do
all
this.
right.
And so that's always been a kind of interesting thing to think about. So in terms of the history of chilies in North America, what we see actually is that it's the slave trade that really kind of reintroduces chili pepper back to North America. So, today in the South, for example, like there's more of a use of, arguably like spice and, chilies than in other areas. And part of that, I think, according to what people think, is mostly due to the fact that you had African slaves coming over to the South and bringing their sort of food cultures, which involved chilies, back into this particular region. So I would be really curious. I'm sure one could look at the historical record. Those of you that are Arkansas archaeologists can probably tell me better, like, what evidence there is for chili peppers. But I would hazard a guess that probably we would see more of a historical time period for when they were introduced or when they were widely used versus maybe in pre-Columbian times. But that's a great question, Tammy.
Thank you. I am in my pajamas, by the way.
I wish, I mean, you could show us if you want, but I don't
No, no, no,
understand if you're not
that's all right.
comfortable.
That's all right.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Do I have a favorite pepper? It's a good question. Um, it's like asking to choose a favorite child. I will say, and again, I feel like people can then hack into my emails. They all play a role in my various passwords because I think like, oh, maybe Latin names are a little bit harder to hack versus others. So I do like all of them. I will say that in terms of like just aesthetics, like if you ask an archaeobotanist, oftentimes they do have a favorite seed because they stare at these things all day. And I think the cutest one is probably pubescens because it's the only one that is black. So it's the black sheep of the family, but also it's just got a really interesting shape. So I actually like that one. So the manzano pepper or the rocoto pepper is my favorite, which incidentally isn't something we could easily find up here. But it's a great question.
I think I might selfishly ask a question if that's okay.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
all of the graphical representations and the map representations that you were showing were extremely interesting. I know at the University of Arkansas we have an interdisciplinary research focus for it's kind of interdepartmental, I guess is how you could put it. Environmental dynamics is what it's called, and there's people in archaeology, there's people in biology, there's people in a ton of different disciplines that are under this bigger umbrella. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit to like the benefit or the utility of being kind of a participant in interdisciplinary research and kind of how that furthers other disciplines in tandem with archaeology as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in this sort of phase of my career, a lot of my work has gone interdisciplinary because I think really to answer large questions, I mean, I feel like archaeology to a certain extent has always relied on different kinds of skill sets. But as, we've kind of encountered larger questions of like, things like, climate change or other kinds of large scale things, like having these different perspectives and different skill sets has really been super useful. I know, like, in my engagement with different kinds of scholars, like, they think about things a lot different than me, which sometimes can cause a little bit of tension, but also it's an opportunity for having a conversation about what it is that different kinds of disciplinary perspectives bring to the conversation. So you can see, even in the case of the Mexican example, like any of those data sets in isolation would have still said something, but it wouldn't have been as powerful as if you had married all of them together, right? As an archaeobotanist, I mean, I do spend time in the field. I do talk to people, but I'm not talking to people as much as like an ethnobotanist who's actually also able to collect live specimens and also gather that knowledge that's so important about how they're being used, how they're being passed around, how they're being like shared generation over generation and curated, and that those little insights into the fact that certain varieties are grown in home gardens or are passed along matrilineal lines versus others that are meant to go to market, right, and meant to be more commercially viable. And of course, I don't have the skill set to deal with like environmental modeling, which involves all kinds of different things that like I was never trained in. And so to be able to just like sit down with these folks and just talk about like, okay, like I'm kind of an idiot when it comes to what you do. Please explain to me in like simple terms what it is you do, and then I'll bring in my perspective about things that I find interesting. Like for example, in the Mexican case study, again, like archaeology, I think can do a lot. Can't do everything, obviously, like I mentioned, there's some limitations, but the way it has been used in domestication research, I think is really a disservice to archaeology because it's not just about like, oh, the earliest, right? Which, you know, if you check out science, or check out PNAS, you check out nature, it's all about like the earliest example of this, right? The first, the biggest, the whatever. Um, I think we offer that ability to offer context, and that can be so powerful. So the ability to actually see things over the long term in the record is something that we bring to the table. So that's just a sort of encouragement to everybody to also just like branch out and talk to people outside of your circle because you know, especially in the modern day and age, I think like people are increasingly interested in kind of figuring out like how we can all come together to address certain things.
Thank
And
you
I
so
think there's
much.
another question in the chat, in the Q&A.
Mhm.
In your opinions, in terms of anthropology, how can we relate importance and variations of peppers across history to pre-domestication? So this is such an interesting that you're actually tackling a question, anonymous attendee, that is something that's been bothering me for a while in the realm of domestication research. And one thing I didn't really touch upon in this talk, which is like, what is domestication, right? And how is it defined for chili peppers? For a lot of us, domestication basically means that like, you know, essentially the organism has responded to humans engaging with this thing over a long period of time to the point where the plant in this case changes the humans or constricts their behavior to a certain extent. And then the humans in change also impact the plant to the point where morphologically it changes and also becomes somewhat dependent on humans for propagation. And it's this almost like mutually beneficial relationship. And so a lot of the research we've done in domestication when it comes to plants has really relied on models that are tied to like crops like wheat or maize or you know things that are high calorie, high yield. And the use of those models to then apply to plants like chili peppers, which, you know, don't offer a ton of calories. You can eat a lot of them, right? They'll fill you up, but they don't actually give you a lot of calories or energy. People don't really, I mean, the main impetus for domesticating chili peppers probably wasn't like, oh, like, you know, making them bigger so there's more food, or yield probably played a role, but for the most part, we're thinking things like flavor, right? Color, size, you know, fragrance, I don't know, whatever. That is something that people wanted more so than like, oh, like size, right? Like bigger potatoes, you know, bigger wheat grains. So unlike in certain kinds of species, like we can't actually identify a point at which something is considered domesticated, right? And so a lot of this question of like, you know, when is it actually domesticated kind of skirts over the issue of like even defining domestication, right? Which we see also kind of continues on through time, where people are continuously reintroducing wild genes back into the domesticated species, as we see in the Mexican example, so that for them, there's no real distinction between wild and domesticated. It's just a continuum of engagement where certain things live in human spaces, certain things are on the fringes and managed, and certain things are kind of more in a wild, untouched state. Um, so yeah, and how can we relate the importance and variations across history to pre-domestication? I mean, I don't know if I can really address that without addressing the elephant in the room, which is again, what is domestication? But I do think that we have to do a lot more in terms of thinking about that, what that even means, how we even define that, how that looks, before we can actually really pin down this question of like, when is something domesticated, right? Like that seed that comes from Paradones, the 10,000-year-old seed, I can't tell you if it's domesticated. We treat it like it's domesticated, but we don't actually know because we haven't necessarily relied on a single definition of what that means. So, yeah, just a sort of reminder that, sometimes it's important just to go back to fundamental questions. And in these kinds of research projects, we have done that. We've gone back and kind of tackled underlying assumptions. And the larger call is basically like we need to kind of rethink how we think about this stuff. And in conjunction with research suggesting that humans came to the Americas much earlier than we thought, we're now kind of rethinking our idea of like, the earliest possibility of people domesticating plants as being like around the time of the Holocene, around 10,000 years ago. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff probably gonna come out in this space, but as of right now, I think to a certain extent, I feel like we're back to square one in terms of like just rethinking how we approach these kinds of topics. Oh, hi, Kathleen. I see it's has there been research into regional cultivation consumption patterns and population-specific physiology? For example, can some populations handle pepper heat better than others, or is that just based on dietary practice familiarity, or are there other biological? Okay, this is a great question, right? And admittedly, I don't study this kind of stuff. There are people that do, but my understanding from my other colleagues is that for the most part, just speaking about population level, there's not like a higher genetic predisposition that they know of for taking on heat better. The issue really is exposure, right? So repeated exposure, according to my colleagues, is the sort of rationale for why, for example, like people from Mexico tend to handle heat better than people like from Scandinavia, perhaps, where the cuisine doesn't really involve a lot of chili peppers. And one thing my Mexican colleague told me about, like, sort of consumption practices in Mexico is that from like very early on, from when they're babies, they're essentially exposed to chilies in smaller amounts, so that over time they almost kind of develop like more of a tolerance for the heat. And I've even noticed myself, like, I don't know if you guys have noticed this as well. This is just a data set of one where, like, if I don't eat chili peppers for a long time, I tend to have more violent reactions to high levels of heat versus when I do regularly consume it, for the most part, like, those negative effects do dissipate. And in terms of like just addressing that thing I talked about with the high, I've only experienced it one time in my life before. If you guys have experienced it before, I'd love to hear about it. But I always thought it was mythical until I had to eat what was it? A ghost pepper on camera, actually. It was for a YouTube channel that never aired. And that was an experience. Yeah, definitely. It was really painful, but at the same time, like I was like, oh, no, this is what they're talking about. I'm like sweating and like my nose is running and everything. And all of a sudden it's like this like euphoria that just settles over you. So again, that could have been because I hadn't eaten a lot of hot peppers. I know hearing from people that regularly consume hot peppers, like they almost become immune to its effect and then have to seek higher and higher levels. So I imagine that that may be one other point of sort of evidence that suggests that us humans are kind of on the same level, but again, it's just about exposure. And yes, do eat more peppers and then tell me about it.
All right. Any final questions from anybody in the audience? Not seeing anything in the Q&A or the chat. All
It's
right.
almost
Well, thank
bedtime.
you. Yeah, no, you're fine. I know. I'm like, go home. I don't know if that is your home, but go home. We want you to
That's
go.
not my home. It's my
Oh,
work, but
okay,
it's
okay. I was
almost like
like,
a second home.
I don't, some archaeologists have a ton of books in their offices, and I'm like, just keep that at work.
Yeah, no, this
But
is just for show.
me too. Thank you so much again for spending your Thursday night with us, Catherine. We really appreciate it. This was a fantastic presentation, and I know I can speak for everyone when we say we learned so much from the talk that you gave. So we really appreciate it.
And thank you all for being here. And feel free to, sort of email me with any questions.